Hey, welcome back as we continue reading the Bible Jesus Read by Philip Yancey. There is in the description below, there's a link, so if you wanted to purchase the book for yourself. We're continuing the chapter 6, The Prophets, God Talks Back, and this section is called Problem Books. Despite my newfound enthusiasm for reading the prophets, I would be remiss if I did not admit to some problems. The prophets are difficult books, more difficult than any other part of the Bible. The three complaints my friend lodged against them, weird, confusing, and all sounds alike, do not easily disappear. As for weirdness, eventually I came to appreciate the prophets for that very quality. I like Monty Python's comedies and Flannery O'Connor's tragedies, and whenever I mention my favorite movies, other people look at me as if I've made some social faux pas. As O'Connor once said in defense of her fiction, to the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures. And the prophets drew very startling figures indeed, and the more I studied them, the more I liked them. Urbane Isaiah walked around stripped and barefoot for 3 years to make a political statement. Imagine how the West Washington Press Corps would treat such a protest today. Jeremiah staggered under an ox yoke to draw attention to a message of doom. Ezekiel lay on his side for months at a time, bound by ropes, facing a clay model of Jerusalem. In these ways, the prophets conveyed something too strong to be reduced to words. Weird? When a tornado is snaking directly toward your neighborhood, you don't deliver polished speeches. You jump up and down and scream like a madman. Another complaint, they all sound alike, soon fell by the wayside as well. Think of the three longest prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. In just a few sentences, I can now identify which of the three a quote is lifted from. Isaiah writes eloquent, soaring prose. Jeremiah weeps and bleeds all over the page. Ezekiel, well, no one else's writings could be mistaken for that strange man's. Orthodox rabbis still forbid anyone under the age of 30 to read the first three chapters of Ezekiel. The criticism of sameness, I concluded, comes from someone who has not really read the prophets, for they constitute a motley crew indeed. True, the prophets deliver a similar message, but each one has a distinctive style. Obadiah compresses his prophecy into one sheet, while a scroll of Isaiah stretched out for 24 feet. Amos was a peasant. Peered under two. Isaiah worked for one king and was killed by another. Daniel prospered under two different pagan empires. Jonah preferred drowning to prophesying. Zechariah's visions made Ezekiel seem tame. The one legitimate criticism my friend made is that the prophets are confusing. No argument. Their style of composition accounts for some of the confusion. In many cases, the prophets were not composed as books at all. Rather, they consist of speeches delivered over many years and later gathered into a collection, with few clues as to context. They thus abound with repetition, shifts of mood, and strange images that somehow meant something to the original audience. Even Martin Luther admitted they have a queer way of talking, like people who, instead of proceeding in an orderly manner, ramble off from one thing to the next, so that you cannot make head or tail of them or see what they are getting at. Must one pore over commentaries for years in order to understand these books? Is there any way for the average person to win through the labyrinth? I have learned a few clues that help me see beyond the arcana to the essential message of the prophets. I present them because they have helped me overcome barriers to reading the prophets, especially barriers that lingered from the prediction fixation of my childhood church. This section is called Now and Later. Sometimes we act as if the prophets lived primarily for the benefit of people not yet born, like us. The very word prophet has come to mean a teller of the fortune, a form of crystal ball gazer. I wish we could scrap the word prophet and replace it with seer, which better conveys their role to see what no one else can, with an x-ray vision into the present and the future. Prophets simply see better than anyone else. And it becomes clear as you read the prophets that now was more important to them than later. I roughly divide the prophet's insights into three categories. One, now. Prophecies that relate primarily to the prophet's own day. Assyria will invade Moab. Israel's alliance with Egypt will backfire. Two, later. Predictions of future events will be removed from the prophet's own time, but later fulfilled in history. For example, the many messianic prophecies that New Testament authors applied to Jesus Christ. Three, much later. Prophecies that seem still to lie in the future, which may include references to a time of worldwide tribulation and a future mass conversion of the Jews. And those scholars disagree on the precise meaning of almost all of such references. A most confusing aspect of the prophets is they do not bother telling us whether the predicted events, invasions, earthquakes, a coming leader, or recreated earth will occur the next day, 1,000 years later, or 3,000 years later. In fact, near and distant predictions often appear in the same paragraph, blurring together. Read Isaiah 13, for example, and you will think the overthrow of Babylon by the Persians will usher in the end of the world. Probably the prophets did not know a timetable. After all, Jesus admitted ignorance of God's schedule while he lived on earth. Or consider Joel 2, which describes the devastation caused by an army of locusts. And nearly everyone assumes Joel was referring to an actual insect plague during his own time, the period I have called now. But the same chapter speaks of a time when the Spirit will be poured out on all people, and sons and daughters will prophesy. Clearly, the passage refers to a later event, the time just after Pentecost. For the Apostle Peter says as much in his sermon in Acts 2. But what of this verse in the middle of the same paragraph? The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Joel is using metaphorical language, of course, but he goes on to describe a gathering of all nations for a final judgment. Much later? And then shifts back to the discussion of Tyre and Sidon and two of Israel's contemporary neighbors. To complicate matters, sometimes the prophets describe an event that apparently has two different fulfillments, one now and one later. Isaiah's famous prophecy, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, from 7:14, fits this category. The next two verses make clear that the sign had a fulfillment in Isaiah's own day. Many scholars assume that the child to be Isaiah's own, and yet Matthew links the prophecy's final fulfillment to the Virgin Mary. Biblical scholars have names for these characteristics of prophets: double or triple fulfillment, part for the whole, creative by association. Naturally, such complicated devices raise questions. How are we to know whether a prophet is describing something in his own day, now, or something unfulfilled, later or much later? Or both? The prophet's creations bring to mind an American primitive painting that has no visual clues of perspective. Its houses, mountains, trees, animals, and farmers all compressed in the same direction. To interpret the scene, the viewer must separate those various elements and reconstruct them in a way that makes visual sense. I believe this prophetic device, admittedly confusing, offers a glimpse into how God views history. As seers, the prophets have insight into God's perspective. And for a God who lives outside the constraints of time, sequence is a minor issue. The Lamb, says the Apostle Peter, was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. 1 Peter 1:20. Paul added that God had chose the followers before the creation of the world. Ephesians 1:4. Similarly, our hope for eternal life was promised before the beginning of time. Titus 1:2. Long before Einstein's theory of relativity of time and space, the New Testament writers established some truths as quite literally timeless. God, a timeless reality, enters our time-bound history as an artist would enter his own painting, suggests C.S. Lewis. Should it surprise us that incursions into time by a timeless being would have overtones that reverberate in Isaiah's day and Mary's, and also our own? The prophesied child of a child during the reign of King Ahaz confirmed Isaiah's predictive abilities and thus gave evidence that Isaiah's other exalted prophecies of wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace would come to pass. Isaiah did not give a time frame for the final fulfillment of his prophecies, For in all probability, he did not even understand such a time frame. The Hebrew prophets spoke to a world spinning out of control. Israel was shrinking, surrounded on all sides by tyrannical powers, and God seemed silent, hidden, and even powerless. The prophets project forward in time to a period when God will break his silence. In that day, they tell us, God will move in forcefully to recreate heaven and earth. He will swallow up death and dry all tears. There will be no more poverty, no hunger, no violence. A banquet feast will be spread for all, one and all. Then we will know God face to face, and all earth will serve him. Almost all predictions, however, had meaning for the original hearers as well as for us thousands of years later. The prophets told of a recreated heaven and earth in order to demonstrate that history would be determined by the future, God's future, and not by the present reality of suffering, chaos, and political upheaval. But in order to believe in such a lofty vision, the audience needed temporal evidence, events being worked out on schedule according to prediction, and in their own time, in the now, hence the predictions that found fulfillment in the prophet's own timelines. Christopher J.H. Wright offers an analogy that helps explain why later generations were so dense at recognizing the later fulfillment of prophecies. Remember, the Jewish scribes all missed the prophecies about Jesus of Nazareth. Imagine a 5-year-old son in, say, 1900 whose father promises him a horse for his 21st birthday. Would such a boy be disappointed if instead in 1916 he receives a Ford Model T? It would be strange. It would be a strange son who would accuse his father of breaking his promise just because there was no horse. And even stranger if, in spite of having received the far superior motor car, the son insisted that the promise would only be fulfilled if a horse also materialized, since that was a literal promise. It is obvious that with the change in circumstances unknown at the time the promise was made, the father has more than kept his promise. In fact, he has done so in a way that surpasses the original words of the promise that were necessarily limited by the mode of transport available at the time. The promise was made in terms understood at the time. It was fulfilled in light of new historical events. That's from knowing Jesus through the Old Testament. All right, we're going to stop there for the day, and we'll pick this back up next week.